Many years ago, I moved from a very small town to a remote valley in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a national forest and not many neighbors. It was exactly what I always wanted. At that point in my life, I had been a paramedic for about 4 or 5 years, and being an outdoorsy, civic-minded person, I decided to volunteer my services to a local search and rescue organization. For such a small and poorly funded organization, we have been surprisingly busy. In the 9 years I've been with them, we've had at least one rescue, sometimes several, every weekend from spring to fall. The source of most of these calls was about 100 miles of poorly maintained fire trails that were very popular with bike and ATV riders. When they inevitably got lost, crashed, and injured, we'd go out, track them down, give them medical attention, and get them in a helicopter or put them on a Stokes basket mounted on some sort of trailer. Would pull with a quad bike. About 2 weeks after joining, and with no training other than what I learned as a Boy Scout and medic, I got the first call. A group of bikers from the city lost a member of their group, and for some reason they put their least experienced rider behind a group of a dozen riders and took off into the woods. When they returned to the trailhead 4 hours later, the inexperienced boy was gone. They went out again and searched for him for 4 to 5 hours, but then gave up and called 911. The amount of time from the first 911 call to when we got the squad together on the way out was pretty impressive. No more than 20 minutes, really. But we were already behind by 9 hours, so we very quickly held a briefing, distributed maps, divided into teams, and set off. I was put in a quad bike with the most experienced guy, and off we went. The plan was for each team of 2 or 3 to ride one of the longer courses surrounding the site. Then, having searched them, we systematically made our way through the shorter, labyrinth-like paths that made up the interior. It had to be a hurried search. None of that net searching, just trolling around for clues. I don't know what I expected exactly. Maybe some dirt roads through the woods or something. But these trails were a real nightmare. These were extremely difficult technical tracks where you really had to know what the hell you were doing and where you were going, or you would never get out. GPS rarely worked due to rough terrain and trees. Radios and cell phones were terrible. And the maps didn't account for all the random riders on the trails. And the only marked roads were fire breaks. And in terms of mileage, they were maybe 10% of the routes. Why this guy wasn't partnered with someone or put at the front of the group is a mystery. And anyway, 4 hours later, I'm caked in mud, bloody from being hit by branches, exhausted, and just at this stage. We take a water break, and we hear that the radio is broken. It seems the bike has been found, but the rider is missing. It's only a few miles away, so we head in that direction. And when we get there, the bike is on the side of the road with the other team's ATVs. But we can see them a few hundred feet away in the woods. We approach and see that they are looking down at the missing person, who is now very dead. The lips are blue, the skin is dull, the hands are spread out like a cross. At first glance, his eyes looked wide and white, but when I examined him, I noticed that his eyes were actually covered in fly eggs. The guy had obviously been dead for a while, and it suddenly made me very nervous. But it didn't make sense. I mean, he still had gas in his motorcycle, and he had water and food, and he was a healthy guy in his early 20s. So why was he dead? It looks like he just put the bike down and then ran off into the woods to die. And, I don't know, mission accomplished, I guess. Anyway, we wrapped him in blankets, then put him on the fire and took him to the trail where the coroner was waiting. A week later, I ran to the coroner and asked what the cause of death was. The pathologist determined cardiac dysthymia secondary to severe anxiety, and this means that the guy literally died of fear, which I always thought of as Hollywood up until that point. I don't know. I always wondered what was on his mind this time. Was he just afraid of the forest or getting lost? If so, why did he run blindly into the woods instead of continuing to follow the trail? There's a part of me that thinks he might have seen something there. I don't know. I've heard a lot of stories about strange things in the woods, and I've seen a few strange things myself, so it really wouldn't surprise me. I, a 26-year-old woman, have always been fascinated by all things paranormal. But there was a time in my life when I wasn't quite a believer. I mean, I was open to the idea of some sort of paranormal entity. But deep down, I don't think I gave it much thought. Over the years, however, it has changed dramatically. Here is one encounter that definitely made me a believer. When my wife and I were newly married, we were very close to another couple who lived in our neighborhood. We traveled with them, met them twice, and we considered them our best friends. One day they went out of town and asked us to look after their animals. They had a cat, a bearded dragon, a red iguana, and 2 rats. We agreed to watch them, and they left. I worked very close to their house, so I went to their house once in the morning, once in the afternoon at lunch, and then again in the evening. I was usually alone during the morning and afternoon visit because my work was closest to their home, and then my wife would join me for the evening visit. One day, during my afternoon visit, I deliberately left the lights off in their house. The animals were getting enough natural light through the house that day to see well without the lights on, and I wanted to save them some electricity bills while they were gone. Again, it was a conscious choice to leave the lights off. It's something I've been actively thinking about. I didn't touch their lights on the way out, and after I checked the animals, I went back to work, again leaving every light switch untouched. But when my wife and I returned that evening, I froze in the driveway. From where I was standing outside, I could see that the lights in the entrance and corridors were on. I immediately told my wife, I did not light these lanterns, I did not touch them. She asked me if I was sure, and I told her I was 1000% sure. We thought that maybe someone from their HOA had come by, one of their family members or something, or that someone noticed they were out of town and maybe broke in. We each put a car key between our knuckles and entered the house. That evening there was an eerie silence in the house. I could not hear the animals move, and the air was very stale, as if I was almost suffocated by its staleness. We slowly made our way through the house, checking closets and looking for signs of disorder. There was a light on in every room we entered. After checking each room and finding absolutely nothing out of place, we both relaxed a bit at least. I even began to trick myself into believing that I had somehow turned on the lights in every room, even the ones I hadn't even entered. Suddenly, we heard a loud stomp coming from the reptile room, the one we had literally just left. The knock was so loud that the whole house shook. We immediately opened the door, but when we entered, nothing moved. Nothing was broken, nothing fell, not even an inch. The only thing that has changed is the bearded dragon. The bearded dragon's enclosure was large and placed on the floor with sliding glass doors. The dragon that was resting peacefully a moment ago when we checked was now rhythmically tapping its nose against the glass in a perfect pattern. He did it over and over. It was almost robotic. I watched in disbelief, never having seen an animal behave like this before. I walked over to the enclosure and carefully opened the glass door. But the dragon continued to tap on the glass, though he was gone for another second or two, and suddenly his beard turned pitch black. He jumped out of the enclosure and flew across the floor, heading straight for the door. Luckily, my wife was able to close the door before he ran away, and having reached the door, he began to rhythmically knock on it with the same pattern as on the glass. Suddenly, on the other side of the door, we heard another loud knock, even louder than the first, and at the same second the cat squealed like mad. It does not meow, but screams. It was an eerie sound, but before I could react, I heard a crash and a crash in the other enclosures behind me. The iguana was wildly waving its tail on the sides of the enclosure and almost hissing. It was a terrible sight. I quickly picked up the bearded dragon and put him back in the enclosure where he continued to bang while my wife grabbed the doorknob. I'll never forget the fear and disbelief in her voice when she said she wasn't opening. I immediately flew to the door and began to pull it with all my might. The handle didn't even turn, but not so as to break. It felt like someone was holding him from the other side. I started banging on the door and screaming. I think that's when the real panic started. My head was foggy, my chest was tight, and I almost thought I was going to pass out at one point. But then, suddenly, everything just stopped. The cat stopped screaming, the iguana stopped thrashing, the dragon stopped knocking, the door handle suddenly moved slightly, and when we left that room, the rest of the lights in the house were turned off. Well, my wife and I ran out of that house as fast as we could and kept quiet the whole way home. The next day, I almost convinced myself that it was all a coincidence and that the animals had upset each other. I spoke to my friend to tell her about the strange experience, to which she replied, "Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that we've had a lot going on at our house lately," I replied. "What do you mean by active?" To which she explained that the former occupant of her home was an elderly man who died in the home after owning it for 40 years. She told me that since they started the renovations, she had seen a male figure standing in the corners of the house or at the foot of the stairs, that he annoyed the animals, and that he also often messed with the light in the room. House. She said he was never violent, mind you, more mischievous, like he was throwing little fits about the changes they were making. However, after that I re-examined my whole view of my belief in the paranormal, and all I can say now is that I damn well believe. A few months ago, my girlfriend and I were driving home from a late-night concert at about 1 a.m. We were in the middle of nowhere, and I decided to stop at a random stop to use the bathroom. I figured the only people in the place at that time would just be truckers and other people in the same situation as me. I got out of the car and walked up to the building, and as soon as I got inside, I noticed some strange things. So the place was like 2 men's rooms and 2 women's rooms and 2 vending machines, one in either corner on either side of the restrooms. When I walked in, there were 2 people, both of them standing directly in front of the vending machines, both of them just looking at the machines without reaching to get the money or actually looking to buy anything. So I walked past these people and into the first men's room. I went inside and was the only person in that room using the U-shaped urinals. A few seconds later, someone else walks in. An older guy in his 50s or 60s, looks like a worker. He walks up and starts using the urinal right behind me, about a few feet away. At first there was nothing alarming about it, but being the cautious man that I am, I already had my pocket knife in hand in the front pocket of my hoodie. After I'm done, I go wash my hands and walk out the door to the first restroom. When I got out, I realized I needed to take a 2-2, so to avoid feeling awkward, I went into the other men's room, noting that these weird vending machine people were in the same place as before. I enter the first stall and try to go about my business when I hear someone else enter the restroom and enter the stall next to me. Keep in mind that there were about 6 other stalls open from me. I thought that was very strange, so I looked down and immediately recognized the guy from the first bathroom in his work boots. This guy just walked in, and I wasn't even there for 2 minutes. I immediately got up and left the bathroom. I started walking quickly out of the building and noticed from the outside, looking back inside, that he also quickly stood up and headed for the outside door. I jumped into the car, and waking up my friend, told her that I would explain everything in a minute, but I put the car in reverse and pulled out. And as I shifted into the wheel, I looked up and saw this guy a few feet away from me standing next to this old beat-up truck, literally, while looking down at me. As I started to drive away, I stared at him and saw him give me this very creepy pantomime look of surprise. I was very tired and confused, but I still don't know what this guy was planning at the bus stop in the middle of nowhere at 1 a.m., or if the vending machine people had anything to do with it. But that's the only time I've actually experienced something like that and felt in real danger. If anyone has had a similar experience or an idea of what this could be, I'd love to hear it because it sure has me confused. So, before I begin, I just want to say that these stories have been told by my family and friends over the years, as well as some of my own encounters in the rural mountains and ranges of my county. I grew up in eastern Kentucky for several years. Starting at age 1, my family on both sides also grew up in rural Appalachians all their lives, but have now moved to a small town located here in a valley nestled between rolling hills and deep ridges. The following stories are set in a rural area deep in the Appalachian Mountains. It has a name and is considered a county, but the area where my father's family grew up in this area, and where these stories come from, is more like a collection of deep ridges and mountain people than anything else that lives there. Just to clear up so there is no confusion as to what it actually is. In the early settler days, these mountains were home to the Cherokee Indians, and many of the cemeteries in the area actually have about 40 Native American graves buried there, marked by stones and rocks. In the 1800s, Colonel George Washington Grayson received the 70,000-acre tract on which my town now stands in lieu of a more traditional Indian burial ground. So the first story. In the 1970s or 80s, my mom and her aunt were driving along an empty road just outside of town with their little cousins when they came to the top of a hill where there was an abandoned farmhouse, and they stopped their car when saw a massive, hovering, saucer-shaped ship hovering over the house. Frightened, my mother and her aunt booked him out of there at high speed, fearing that they would soon continue down the mountain path into town. However, when they looked in the rearview mirror, they saw that the ship that was following them at high speed was tailing the car and keeping up with it. They tried several times to evade this craft, but it was fruitless. He chased them for over a mile back into town until finally, at the edge of the county road leading back into town, he finally seemed to disappear. My mother told this story at least 100 times to family and friends, most of whom believed her as they had also seen strange lights in the sky in and around various areas of the community. However, some do not. Although, of course, some don't. A few years ago, she drew me a picture of a spaceship that I still have. It's gray and almost metallic, by the way, which is how she painted it. It has red lights around the edges of the bottom of the ship, as well as some green lights on the sides. The second story happened during my mother's childhood, old enough to know when something was going on. Then she was at home with her parents and siblings one night when a man her mother and family already knew broke into the house and scared everyone out of their wits. He lived in a cabin deep in the woods a few miles away. And during his time there, he reported poltergeists, orbs, and paranormal activity on the grounds and in the house itself. He continued to tell my grandmother that he was allegedly tormented all night by a demon that threw pots and pans, glasses, and even furniture at him. This went on almost all night, and it threw them completely out of the cupboards, almost hitting him with it. It is also reported that he started knocking on the sides of the house and knocking on the walls and ceiling and all that. Finally, he mustered up the courage to say the Lord's Prayer and try to rebuke her in the name of Jesus. And it seemed to make him worse, and it made him become even more aggressive, and now try to kill him with even heavier objects, it seemed. It was at that point that he ran out of the house and spent about 7 or 8 hours walking through the woods and countryside back to my grandmother's house. But as he walked towards the house, he reported that he could have sworn he heard footsteps trailing behind him in the woods and next to the road. He didn't see anything, and it went on like that for hours until he finally reached their house. The following story took place in the 90s, in a town that sat by a white brick house on top of a small hill, and there was a man and his wife lived there. The man was 50 years old, and the woman, I believe, was about the same age. Anyway, one day, when my mother was working at a local gas station where a woman also happened to be working, a man called her and said there was something wrong with the gas in the house, and that he was going to go look to see if he could fix it. The gas was in the basement, apparently. He went down the stairs, lay on his back and crawled under the thing to see what happened and lit a match. As you can imagine, the entire house immediately exploded, sending rubble everywhere and a massive fireball and smoke that could be seen across the city. The man's wife, who saw the explosion at the gas station, ran home to find the entire house gone and nothing left but the foundation. The man's body, as it should be expected in this situation, was blown to pieces, and body parts were even lying in some neighboring houses. It has since become a local legend that the ghost of a man haunts the house that was built on the land where the original Ghostbusters show or another Ghostbusters series I can't remember. In fact, the episode was filmed here because of the experiences of the residents of the house. Everything from banging pots and pans and throwing various things to real manifestations in the residence. The next story happened with my dad's family. They lived in a series of ridges and ridges. For the sake of this story, I'll call it Webb, Kentucky. My father's entire family has lived there since the 1800s. I looked into our family tree and it is full of history. From the old one-armed Irishman who built the 2-story log cabin where my father's family grew up, and where his grandparents, my great-grandparents, lived all their lives, to Native American heritage. But the next story takes place in my uncle's house, which is a 2-story log cabin built by an Irishman. My uncle died in 2010 of a massive heart attack in the driveway of the house, and since then, it has been mostly empty except for my aunt, grandmother, and sister, who stay there in the spring and summer. The house itself has had a history of paranormal activity, from disembodied footsteps coming from upstairs rooms to voices and apparitions. All my life, my dad, his sister, and brothers have always sworn that the house is haunted by the spirits of my great-grandfathers, the one-armed man who also built the estate, and maybe even my late uncle who died there. But that's not the only thing that happened there. You see, in the late 90s or early 2000s, sometime around that time, my uncle, who liked to spend time in the woods day and night, used to go hunting with his pack of hunting dogs, and one evening he was on one of his night hunts, and according to my aunt, who heard the story from my uncle, who then told his grandparents, he was in the woods when something chased him out with great success, and he said he heard a biped walking with its tail behind him in the woods. His hounds were like raptors, also looking scared and not chasing whatever it was. He was running through the forest when he heard everything chasing after him. He barely made it home, apparently holding his teeth, because whatever was there chased him all the way to the property. And apparently, he told the story to my family a few weeks later while visiting. The following story: my uncle, my dad's older brother, returned to the mountains after several years in a nearby town. After his remarriage, the family kept up with him from time to time, but he went there on his own and did pretty well. Unfortunately, however, he was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer in mid to late 2016 and was given a short few months to a year to live. Seeing that he did not want to die in the city, he decided to return to the hills at home. He spent some time trying to find a suitable house or trailer for his family to move into, but after a while he finally found a house located on a very steep hill with a gravel road leading uphill to a house surrounded by dense forest. A dark forest in the backyard that was fenced in a massive rock face with even more wood around it. The house was what I would call a log house with light brown wood covering the outside and a tin or shingle roof. It even had a small hot tub off the side of the small porch, but it hadn't been used in quite some time, so it was in a state of disrepair. But in front of the yard, in a medium-sized garden that the previous owners had made, there was a grave. Yes, the real one. It was apparently a stillborn baby, a fetus that had died in the 1970s and 80s before, and had been buried there ever since. Personally, I found it extremely weird and a bit annoying, but the inside didn't get any better either. Whoever lived there before must have left in a hurry, because he left all his belongings inside. Dishes were left on the kitchen tables. There was a TV. The bed frames were knocked together in the bedrooms. Only the sheets themselves were taken. The little girl's clothes and the mini TV mouse were stuffed in the back bedroom closet. And the backyard was possibly the strangest sight of all. There was a huge pile of burning consisting of furniture and pieces of other articles and personal belongings, all charred and black with a giant black circle around the pile, marked by a black outline in the dirt. I mean, the whole house was very eerie and kind of eerie, like something was wrong, very wrong. My father, as a promise to his dying brother, immediately began work on the house, arranging for a satellite television connection in the living room, where my uncle and his family were forced to sleep while work went on elsewhere. House. However, soon this happy place of residence turned apparently into a real nightmare. For example, while sleeping in the living room, you will probably hear footsteps on the wooden floor. Doors were closing and opening by themselves, and shadows were visible. The uncle began to see a small boy and an older man in overalls and straw hats, who after a while would torment him, apparently until his death. His wife, who thought he was losing his mind, never knew anything strange was going on. That was until she saw a boy in overalls running past the kitchen window at the kitchen sink. When he went outside, it was evident that nothing was there, but his daughter soon after began to feel the strangeness of the property, for she told her mother that she had recently been playing with the boy in her room, and when she went to see what was going on, it was evident that no one was there. Was home. My uncle was also constantly tormented by these spirits, even locking out my family who went to see him in his bedroom for fear they would hurt them. Eventually, however, it was revealed that they had finally escaped from the house, exhausted from all the aggressive activity inside the house. My uncle eventually passed away in 2017, but the whole time he was home, he was plagued by the restless mood of a man and a boy. After his death, the family's pastor and another preacher went to the property and blessed it, and even tried to drive out the dark entities that visit the house. Allegedly, they sprinkled holy water on the walls, front and back doors, and ordered the spirits to leave in the name of Jesus. And after that, no one knows for sure if the property was active again, because no one ever lived in it again. The following story. My father spent the night at my grandmother's when she was still alive. She died in 2018. He stayed with her most of the time because she was scared at night, and apparently she had some form of blackout, and she saw and heard things at night, so he stayed to calm her nerves at night. Her sister was staying for the week that night, and he decided to go up and hang out with them for a while and stayed the night, and about midnight or thereabouts he was awoken by the sound of trash being shuffled around, and a loud thump, for whatever it was that knocked the lid off the trash, making a loud noise that woke my aunt and my grandmother, when they got my dad. Investigate whatever the violation is. Grabbed my grandfather's old gun and flashlight. He opened the back door and went out to investigate. Seeing a trash can on the ground and a trash can being picked over, he walked a little further through the back to see if there was anything there. And then, apparently, he saw it. Walking back up the hill and back into the forest was a very large and very tall being, all dressed in white, with red eyes reflecting the flashlight light reflecting off of him. The creature kept looking at him as it walked back into the forest and disappeared into the thicket. My father came back inside, white with what he had just seen, as pale as a ghost. My aunt tried to ask what happened, and then he told her, and they called my mom on her home phone. And retelling the encounter, my mother asked my half-brother to find any strange encounters from the area, and indeed found one. Apparently the man reported that he was being followed in the woods as he walked down the same road, and he never saw anything, but whatever it was, followed him every step of the way. It also turned out later that apparently there is a legend about the devil himself roaming the woods there or something. And now, to my personal experience. So, my dad and I went to a village cemetery deep in the mountains, and this cemetery has been around for at least 80, 90 years. The cemetery is on a small hill with a very steep road that only a very good four-wheel drive truck or all-terrain vehicle could drive there. It is located between four-way roads, with only one house, a double-wide trailer, located down the slope. It had been vacant and for sale for a year or two, and was empty during our visit. It is surrounded by a fence, and in the middle sit 2 pine trees where my family is buried. My grandparents are buried there, as well as my uncle, who had a haunted cabin in a previous story. He buried his ashes there at the foot of my grandfather's cellar. 3 more aunts and uncles are buried there, as well as my great-grandfather and grandmother. But anyway, we got out and entered through a chained gate that had to be broken and opened from the outside. We sat near the grave of my grandparents for 20, 30 minutes, just talking. Sometimes we liked to take a short walk around the grounds. We usually did this before heading back into town, and today was no different. We walked around looking at graves from the 1700s and 1800s, as well as Cherokee graves marked by stones at the very end of the cemetery. However, I did find something strange on the ground next to a flat grave marker from the 1800s. It was a large barefoot, at least twice the size of mine, and I sat there stunned by what I saw because his big toe was extremely large and round in the shape of a perfectly round quarter. Her arch was very wide and curved, very sharp, making the rest of the foot almost look sideways. This means that whatever it was there the night before it passed. I examined the ground around the cemetery and did not see any other traces. Nothing. When I got home, I told my mother what happened. She seemed to believe me and my father, considering I'd never lied about anything or seen anything like this before, and saw the surprise on her face. After a while, my aunt was visiting, and I told her about the footprint I found there, and what she told me was very creepy. She told me that when my second uncle, my father's second brother, was there visiting the graves many years ago, he came home and said there was something in the cemetery. He said he felt he was being watched and was very scared when he was there alone and saw what appeared to be a very distinct and strange mark on one of the graves. Another story. When my grandmother died in autumn at the beginning of winter 2018, my aunt and uncle moved into a trailer until they could find a new home and move from Tennessee to be closer to family. Many people who stayed overnight there while my grandmother was still alive would swear that the spirit of my grandfather, who died of cancer in hospice in the trailer many years ago, visited the house because they heard strange footsteps at night. There were always voices and knocking on the walls of the carriages. My father even encountered these oddities. The knocking came from outside, and if you looked outside or went out with your gun, there was never anything there. Before my grandmother died, my father's only living brother came to her in the wagon one evening and said that he saw my grandfather standing by her with his arm around her and said, "Son, I'm going to your mother very quickly," and then he disappeared. And my grandmother did join him a few months later. This was when my aunt and uncle moved after and nothing strange happened. Well, still, I guess. They eventually found a suitable new home to move into, and on cold winter nights, the electricity in the trailer would sometimes go out in the dead of night, as you'd expect considering the electricity bill hasn't been paid since the move and all. But we got to the house and started moving them out, loading boxes of clothes, TVs, couches, and beds into a U-Haul parked in the yard with the engine running and the keys in the ignition. When suddenly all the sources of light we had that helped us see suddenly went out. The flashlight we hung on the porch in front of the front door went out. The U-Haul's engine completely shut down, and we got out and turned it back on. But a few moments later, it happened again. Everything went completely dark. That's when I could have sworn I was being watched while I was in the rooms of the trailer. I felt like someone was following me, and I could have sworn that sometimes I heard a woman's voice saying hello, and also a man's voice that my father also heard when he was in the living room. It went on and off, and finally, after everything was loaded into the U-Haul, and we were regrouping outside getting ready to leave, and we were talking in the yard, I swear I heard someone walking on the hardwood floor of the house. We left moments later, and a few months after that a new family moved in rehabbing the trailer, and as far as we know, no other paranormal activity has been reported since then. But it was surreal, and I'll tell you, never forget. Next story. My father and I were returning to town after visiting my aunt, his sister, and my uncle has a trailer. It was late in the evening, it was raining, and everything was really dirty and wet. A little fog hung over the hills and ridges. Well, we came to a little turn about a mile from their house, and all of a sudden this woman with short black hair comes out of a thick forest next to the forest, and my father almost hit her head-on and swerved to avoid her. She was wearing a rain jacket, black sweatpants, and dirty shoes, and it looked like she had been out in the woods all night, maybe even a week, because her pants, jacket, and shirt were covered in dirt. She looked soaking wet, and her hair was a complete mess. She looked very disheveled, and looked at us the whole way, just looking, and I even looked back in the rear-view mirror. She was still there on the side of the road, looking at us without even going back into the woods or leaving. She stood and watched all the time. We never saw her again. But I often wonder what she was doing there, wet and alone, all disheveled. I always wonder if she was kidnapped, and maybe something happened to her. But either way, something definitely went wrong. The following story is about my brother, and my brother and his friend were deer hunting in the woods near his house. It was years ago, so nothing recent. But they were walking through the woods with their guns when they suddenly noticed something in a tree watching them. This thing jumps from a high vantage point, as it is about 10 or 20 feet high, and falls to the ground below without even being seriously injured. It was evidently covered with thick matted fur and stood on two legs. They aimed their weapons at him, but apparently the creature screamed at them, though he said it was more like a roar, and it charged at them, and they apparently ran out of the forest as fast as they could, for this creature chased them around for quite some time before finally losing it and coming home in one. A piece, And the next and last story, one in my aunt and uncle. They are the oldest in my mother's family. My uncle actually served in the Vietnam War and was even actually captured with his brother at one point during his time overseas. They were held hostage by the Viet Cong in the jungle, and he often told stories of how they whipped them and beat them, and all kinds of merciless things, and threw feces at them and all kinds of things. But after he returned home, they lived in the countryside where my mother's family saw Ad grew and throughout their lives until she moved to the city and opened a private nursing home and hospice where my aunt personally cared for terminally ill patients from dementia to cancer, and she treated them with all respect and kindness. However, around the early 2010s, after she was long retired and my uncle started to get sick, and the organization that helped them get the house foreclosed on them, and they were forced to move to a nursing home on the interstate. It was a high-rise apartment, largely located on the interstate. Mostly elderly people and people with disabilities lived there. Then, about a few months, maybe a year into their stay there, one night they saw an elderly woman with Alzheimer's walking on a frozen pond near the building. No one even knew she was gone, but they watched with horror as the woman fell under the ice and drowned in the lake. No one discovered her body until the next morning, but after that, however, some say her spirit lingered in the building. My aunt and uncle often talked about hearing footsteps, and one night my uncle got up for a drink in the middle of the night and saw a woman standing in the middle of the living room. Frightened, he turned on the light, and as soon as he did, she disappeared. Apparently, this went on for months and weeks as well, with the spirit of this woman haunting their home. They eventually had to move again after my uncle had dementia years earlier, but at this time it started to progress even further, and only last year he lost his long battle with this vicious disease, and so after that, no one does not know what else happened there. So me and my family had a wonderful and amazing experience living here. It's a lot, I know, but I hope you enjoyed them, and I hope nothing weird happens from here on out. It was February 22nd. I took the bus home as usual, was hanging out with friends after school, so it was around 7 p.m. and dark. I was the only one on the bus until this guy, who I guessed was 40 years old, got on at one of the stops. He looked pretty sketchy, so I didn't really look at him, but he looked like Eminem. Anyway, the bus driver stops and takes a break for something. I don't know, but he says we can't stay on the bus while he's gone. So the sketchy guy gets up and grumbles and swears to himself about how cold it is and whatnot. However, we all get out, and the ridiculous guy and the bus driver go to the Circle K we were stopped at. I don't want to stand in the dark alone, so I follow them. The thing is, by the time I get there, sketchy guy is back. I try to avoid eye contact and not disturb this guy, but he stops me and starts saying something like, "Look at you. You're not even dressed for the weather. How old are you? You shouldn't go out like that." He then offers me his jacket, to which I politely decline, and then proceeds to offer to buy me a hot chocolate. I'm getting pretty uncomfortable at this point, so I just say yes and go in with him. He buys me a hot chocolate and I say thank you, and he just starts talking about how the bus driver is a horrible person for kicking us out, etc. etc. Leaves without us. I catch up with him to the next stop and shoot him between the eyes. I thought, wow, okay, what do I even have to say to that? He starts threatening to kill the bus driver until he drops the bomb and says, "I've done this before, you know. I've killed a man before." I'm just walking there, trying to come up with a response to a literal confession of murder. All I could think at the time was, did he deserve this? And he says, "Oh yes, he did," and then just doesn't talk to me for the rest of the bus. I have no idea what I am supposed to do with this information. I looked for pictures of killers in my area, and there was nothing like him. So should I give it to the police or what? Let them know that the killer is on the loose and is believed to have not yet been caught. I am very scared by all this. I'm not sure if he was trying to scare me or what, but any advice would be greatly appreciated. I'll start by saying that we were 13 years old at the time, and my friend and I would often sneak out of each of our houses during our sleepovers for night walks. It was also the basis of this terrible meeting, and it prevented us from getting out again from the onset of darkness. My friend lived opposite a huge forest, so her house was the best choice for us to go out at night because the forest was more scary and exciting, I guess. And we always brought flashlights, food, and blankets to camp for a couple of hours before returning home. Art. Well, on that fateful night, we accidentally fell asleep instead of sleeping. So when my friend suddenly roused me from sleep, it was already past 3 a.m., which was much later than we usually go out. We grabbed our essentials and crept out the back door into the cold and dark night. The frost crunched under our feet as we crossed the deserted road, and when we approached the entrance to the forest, we noticed that it was pitch black and completely quiet. Actually, it's unpleasant. We lit our torches, stepped onto a rough path into the forest, the light shining on a tree swaying in the icy wind. We stepped on fallen, sodden leaves and bark as we made our unsteady but familiar path into our favorite part of the forest, our cold breathing the only noise that broke into the deafening silence. We reached a little hut which we had built one afternoon, made entirely of sticks, solely to shelter our camps. There were times when vandals or other children damaged our hut, but for the most part it remained intact. But this time it was completely destroyed, almost like a foreshadowing of what was to come. We had just decided to stop and come back later that day to repair the hut when we heard this. A loud, squealing giggle made the hair on the back of my neck instantly stand on end. My friend and I jumped in shock and looked at each other like, what the hell is that? We were absolutely crazy. Again, there was a horrible and unnatural giggle that belied the silence and made my skin crawl. "Someone's here," my friend whispered to me, looking completely terrified. "We have to go now." Her voice of reasoning made me even more scared and tense that someone was with us in the woods at 3 o'clock in the morning. We simply looked at each other in agreement and took off running in unison, our steps moving along the path as naturally as we could with muscle memory. Our uneven breaths of air accentuated the giggles that seemed to be following us now, closer and closer. The light from our torch rose and fell with our rapid movements, illuminating random patches of trees and brush, when we finally saw a small light as we neared the entrance to the forest. Running out of the woods, we didn't stop until we reached the back door of my friend's house and nearly collapsed, gasping for breath with relief to be safe. Then my friend's eyes widened, and she pushed me, pointing a shaking finger at the road. A gagged woman of indeterminate age was standing at the entrance to the forest, giggling that horrible, horrible giggle and waving at us. We screamed and ran inside and peered into my friend's bedroom window through the tiniest gap in the curtain and could still see the woman standing there for some time. Even worse, she was looking right at us, almost as if, I don't know, she knew we were there somehow. We could tell she was still giggling that hideous, horrible laugh, and then she just turned very slowly and walked back into the forest again. Needless to say, we never returned to that forest again, and we never left it after dark. So, I'm going to start by saying that I'm mostly a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal, although I love hearing other people's stories and opinions when it comes to such things. That's why it's so hard for me to understand what happened to me last September. You see, my dad, grandma, grandpa, and I attended my cousin's wedding in a small country town near South Haven, Michigan late last summer. We rented a small house in town that was in a very wooded area near a small lake. However, as soon as I got out of the car at our rental property, I felt very uncomfortable. That's the best way I can describe it. Something felt, and it immediately became restless. But being the skeptic that I am, I shrugged it off and just chalked it up to fatigue and anxiety. The night we arrived, my dad and I were smoking outside and noticed how strange everything sounded. It was around 11 p.m. and no one was around, but the trees were cracking incredibly loudly, and we also heard some strange animal noises. But I think nothing unusual. Just the kind of animal sounds you might hear in rural Michigan, I guess. But just for some reason they seemed particularly strange to us. Anyway, we said goodnight and went to bed. The next morning, my dad told me that he went outside for a smoke at about 2 o'clock in the morning and heard what he thought was someone nearby banging on metal siding or something. He said it felt like it was very close, but he didn't hear anything leading up to or in front of the loud bang, like footsteps or anything like that. In the end, we brushed it off and just laughed it off. However, It was the second night that I heard something that I can't stop thinking about 6 months later. It was around 11 p.m. to midnight, and I had my last smoke of the night. My grandparents were already asleep, and my dad went to bed, but he didn't sleep and just watched TV. I was sitting on the steps behind the house looking straight out into the backyard when I heard someone yell my name very sharply, loudly, and quickly. It was like they were yelling at me from the front of the house, like they were standing on the porch yelling for me, knowing I was in the back of the house. And it sounded like my dad, but it couldn't have been him because I didn't hear the front door open or close or anything. Being the skeptic that I am, I reminded myself to stay calm and quickly return to the house. My father was fast asleep, so there was no way he would be back in bed by the time I got to him. I woke him up anyway and asked if he was outside yelling my name. He looked confused and said of course not. At this point I started to get really nervous. I tried to go to sleep, but I just couldn't get the scream out of my head. I stayed up all night trying to figure out what happened. I was seriously thinking of leaving, taking a hotel room somewhere nearby and coming back in the morning. Miraculously, I must have fallen asleep somewhere around 3 a.m. We woke up the next morning, and I was so ready to get out of this town. As soon as we left, the nagging feeling that I had had an entire weekend disappeared. When I returned to work the next day, I told my colleague about my strange experience. Her face immediately fell. She went on to inform me that this was apparently a fairly common occurrence in the Appalachian area regarding cryptids and other types of creatures. They're probably trying to get your attention by impersonating someone close to you, and when you look at them, they kidnap you or something. But I was in Michigan. I tried to find information about the city I was in, but couldn't find anything interesting or related. So I'm wondering if anyone else has had a similar experience to mine. And if there is, what was it? It was April 2008. I was 20 and living in Denver on a 1-year contract with a non-profit in Boulder. My girlfriend, now wife, and my best friend Tim came to Colorado from our home state to visit me for my 21st birthday. The nonprofit I worked for housed their workers in dormitories, and no drinking was allowed on site. Visitors were also not allowed to stay overnight. So I booked a hotel in downtown Denver for the weekend where we could drink in celebration of my 21st. The hotel was large, very nice, and in a safe central area of the city. So good, in fact, that it was the same hotel that most politicians later stayed at during the 2008 DNC convention held in Denver later that summer. My wife and Tim. They arrived on Saturday morning and we all met at the hotel. The day was fantastic. We spent most of the day drinking around town. We got back to the hotel around 1 o'clock in the morning. The room was typical with 2 queen beds. Bed number 1 was next to a large window overlooking the city. Bed number 2 was pushed up against the wall with a door that opened into the bathroom. You couldn't see the door or the entrance to our room unless you were by bed number 1. We were still drinking and chatting in the room until about 4 a.m. My wife was lying at the head of bed number 2, flipping through the TV. Tim and I sat at the foot of bed number 1 and looked out the window as we talked. As we were talking, I heard some movement and the sound of a door opening. Without taking my eyes off the window, I assumed that it was my wife who got up to go to the bathroom. A few minutes passed and I thought I heard movement again, so I finally turned to look. I saw that my wife was still lying in bed number 2 as before. "Did you get up a few minutes ago and go to the bathroom?" I asked her. "No," she answered. "I thought I heard a door." I answered her and she just looked at me confused. "Yeah, I thought I heard that too," Tim said, looking away from the window. That's when I started freezing and sobered up pretty quickly. Very quietly, I heard Tim say, "Hey, I think there's someone in our room." I jumped off the bed to peer into the pitch-black entryway. I could barely make it out and I wanted to believe I was just seeing things. But there was a man dressed in all black with a black baseball cap wedged into the 90-degree corner of the entrance, where the door of the room met the wall. The room was completely silent, and it seemed like hours had passed when I started to panic and said to myself, "Nothing like this has ever happened in my life." But we all knew. We knew we weren't alone and hadn't been alone for a while, and he knew that we noticed him. Eventually, Tim plucked up the courage to meekly speak in the direction of the corner in the driveway and said, "Hey man, can we help you with anything?" Another period of silence that felt like an eternity. He lowered himself from the edge of the wall a little into the light and looked at Tim and me with his eyes. We all looked at each other. Finally, he spoke up and said, "Is this room 1709? "No, it's not like that," said Tim, nervously stroking his beard. He looked at us for a while longer, raising his eyebrows and shaking his head. And then he turned and left. Then we burst into a million curse words and walked around the room. I called the front desk. I was told that he was drunk and that they found him on the landing but directed him back to the right room. A few minutes later, Tim called the front desk and was told he was not a guest. He was apparently grabbed on the stairwell and taken to the police station. And after some time, they told my wife that he disappeared and they don't know who he is or what he is doing. She was told that the hotel didn't even have room 1709. We got 3 different stories from the front desk is what I mean, and we still have no idea what it was or how he managed to get the key card to our room. We were sure that the door was really closed. It was the most terrifying moment of my life, and my advice is to always use the latch in hotel rooms. We were refunded for our stay and about $200 in food credit from the hotel. We would have sued, but we were young and stupid and honestly just wanted to get out of there and forget about it. So at 18, I was kicked out of my mother's house and went to live with my uncle and father in Selma, Alabama. It was an old house that belonged to my grandmother before she died. When I was younger, my family would tell me stories about the house, that it was haunted or something, and that it was once a slave house. Selma has a history of slavery and was once even called the Slave Town, so I believe the stories. There were even rumors that a witch lived in the house even before my grandmother. There are also rumors that my grandmother's brother even dated a woman who was believed to be a witch, and apparently she used to put candles with a chicken with its head cut off in the middle or something near the door. My family members have told me their stories of seeing and hearing the paranormal around the house, but at this point I haven't seen anything myself, so I thought they were all just superstitious and paranoid. Anyway, after a while I moved into my father's old room and he warns me that one day I will start hearing voices. I had a dog at the time, and he even warned me that one day my dog would die. His exact words were a little more cryptic than that, but I got it. He said that they will either kill you or the dog. I laughed, thinking he was just joking, to be honest. He told me that my aunt was a secret witch and that I could not trust my uncle. He also told me that when something starts calling you out of the room at odd times, it's not real. Then I laughed at him even more, because I remembered how other members of the family said that he was crazy and sometimes talked to himself. Despite his statements, for a while everything seemed fine. One day I was getting ready to leave Selma for a job interview in Montgomery. My aunt saw me dressed and asked me where I was going. I told my aunt, who also lived there at the time, that I was going to take a nap and then go to Montgomery for work and an interview. A few hours later, I left the house to find my front wheel cut. Suddenly, an aunt appeared out of nowhere and asked what happened. It was a little weird for me. She was behaving out of the ordinary, but I had no doubt about it. Fortunately, I had a spare in the Jeep. I fed my dog and drove to Montgomery, and it was dark when I got back to Selma a few hours later. My uncle, however, said that my dog died, and he didn't know what happened to him, and that he too had already been buried. I thought my dog was dying mysteriously, so I asked my aunt's children, who always play outside, what happened, and one of the children told me that they beat the dog and kicked it until it stopped moving. I'd never heard this kid talk like that, and he was very serious about it. Well, at least he was. Didn't blink or laugh while saying it. At that point, I realized something was wrong with my parents, and the next day, my father happened to walk into the house. But before I could say anything about the dog, he said, "I told you they were going to kill him." He also said he saw my uncle talking to some Mexicans who were known for their voodoo when he walked by late last night. Again, I just laughed because my father was always a jokester. But deep down, I started to get very worried, I must admit. Anyway, the next day, as soon as I woke up, I had this weird, unreal feeling. Then I heard my father calling my name from outside the house. He named me by the nickname he used to call me as a child when he lived with my grandmother. I was about to leave too when I remembered what he said. If something starts calling you out of the room at odd times, it's not real. I stopped for a few seconds, then opened the door, but as he said, no one was there. It was very early in the morning. My father was probably at work, and 2 days later I woke up at 3 in the morning. I left the house because I felt strange. As I was walking around the house, I heard sounds like birdsong whizzing over my head. When I looked up, I saw nothing but black shadows flying everywhere. I looked up at the sky and the moon was so close to the ground it could have been a giant eyeball staring right at me. A few days after that, the people from the interview called back and said I got the job. I was supposed to start next week, but later that night I felt a presence in the room with me as I tried to sleep. It was negative, so I put on my headphones and put on some positive music. But even as the music played, it felt like the presence was getting stronger and stronger. Somehow my left earbud also fell out of my ear, and then I heard a dog or wolf or something growling in the room. I even felt the vibration of the growl. I immediately got up and left the house, and did not return until morning that night. Later in the week, I was going to leave home to live with my family in Montgomery for work. I packed all my things and was ready to go. I sat down on the bed to rest a little before I left, when suddenly I heard something run up to the side of the bed. Something grabbed my hair and pulled me. The force literally almost pulled me off the side of the bed. It was then that I left at that moment, and after that I swore to myself that I would never return, and since then, I never went back. December 3rd, 2022. It was about 10 p.m. My daughter was sleeping on the couch. I took her to bed. She started sleepwalking again and said, "Enough, Daddy." I said I didn't do anything, Kelly. I laughed, and then she stopped in her tracks, and then she took this weird pose, leaning forward, her arms out to her sides with her fingers spread, and she said, "I'm not Kelly," but in an old woman's voice with a deliberate pause before saying my name. "Of course you are, Kelly, you fool," I replied, and laughed. Then she went to her bedroom half asleep. She lay down in bed and closed her eyes. I kissed her head and said, "I love you, Kelly." She began to stir in bed and announced with closed eyes, I said I'm not Kelly. The same old lady's voice and the pause before the name, and now a little irritation in the voice. Then I realized that it wasn't my daughter who was teasing someone. It could be someone else. I got goosebumps and said with a slight stutter in my voice, "If you're not Kelly, who are you?" Then my daughter opened her eyes, raised her head and adjusted herself to be eye to eye with me, and began to stare intently into my dull black eyes without color. Hours. Then she lay down on the pillow again, closed her eyes and immediately went back to sleep. I woke her up and it was like I woke her up from a deep sleep. I said, "Kelly, are you okay?" She says, "Yes, Dad, why did you wake me up?" I said, "Oh, nothing, just checking you're okay," and then asked her to pray with me, which she did without any problem, perhaps with a little confusion. Then I kissed her head, told her I loved her, and left her to go back to sleep. The next day I had to deliver the package to my next-door neighbors. My brother and sister answered the door. I gave them the package, then asked how they were, because their mother died in the summer, and I said, "How do you feel? Your mom about all this?" The daughter replied, "Oh yes, they often feel her presence, and that they have also seen a ghost in the field in front of the house of a 6-year-old girl who died on the playground that used to be there." She then told me that she and her mother regularly used a Ouija board to connect with the little girl, and did this many times while talking to her, and the little girl replied that she was protecting the area so that other children would not be killed there, as well as a family friend who died and still visited them in spirit form, apparently wearing a hood, and was seen walking around their rooms at night to check on them. I replied that I didn't really mess with those things and just said goodbye to them, but I was left with a very bad feeling in my stomach. 2 days later, I went to bed for an early shift at work. I went to bed at 11 p.m. and went right to sleep. Suddenly I woke up, but my eyes were closed, and in my head I heard myself say, "There is someone in the room." I opened my eyes, and in the darkness, I saw a man with white hair and black glasses working on a device, pressed against it, where the side of my wife's bed is. I jumped back in shock and started to get out of bed. I turned away for a brief moment, and when I looked back, he was gone. However, This was a real person, completely solid and real in appearance. I wasn't scared then. I must have been completely confused. After drinking some water, I lay back down and somehow fell asleep again. Then it happens again. I suddenly wake up with my eyes closed and my mind tells me again that someone is in the room. I open my eyes. However, this time things are more ominous. To my right, by the bed where my wife sleeps, there is a creature with matte black eyes looking at me. In fact, the eyes reminded me of how my daughters looked a few days ago. Whatever it was about 4.5 feet tall and looked like a cross between maybe a gargoyle and a gremlin with no wings and long pointed ears pointing straight up. Nostrils like a gorilla. Her skin was dark green and leathery with light orange-brown tips running down her arms. It was looking straight at me with a mouth that seemed to be foaming on one side, and it looked very old, almost haggard, perhaps very hungry, and was breathing slowly as it looked my way. I slowly got up from the bed without leaving him for a second, and slowly walked around the bed to him, and noticed that he had very long arms with what looked like 5 fingers with claws on each hand. The way he was standing reminded me of the forward-leaning pose my daughter had earlier in the week with her arms hanging by her sides. I also noticed when I moved away from the bed, his gaze didn't follow me. It seemed to be just looking at where I was sleeping. And when I got a little closer, maybe 5 feet, he just disappeared from the room, as if it had just been here in reality and then suddenly disappeared. Not like he faded, but more like he just blinked out of reality. Well, apparently now I was scared and then I was awake. The next 2 weeks were fine, but from the end of December 2022 to February 2023, I started having serious problems sleeping. I feel like I'm being watched all the time. But I also feel the icy wind blowing into my neck, spine, and sometimes my knees. My wife and the rest of my family are fine. My neck, knees, and face are very cold, especially between my eyes and nose. If I'm lucky, I'll have 1 or 2 days of good sleep, and then a couple of days of bad sleep, maybe 2 hours of sleep each day. I've been to the doctor, had urine and blood work done, and everything was fine. I was given sleeping pills and I took sedatives. They do help, but it still happens and I get cold and sometimes feel like, I don't know, something is watching. I also saw the vicar and blessed myself and blessed the crucifix and the Bible. And when I went around the house saying the Lord's Prayer and then told him to leave by the power of God and Jesus, it seemed to help for a day. The house became very positive and bright, and I slept very well. But the next day, I had another horrible dream, and it was almost like a nightmare. I really don't know what to do. It really bothers me for obvious reasons, but to others, it probably sounds like a bad horror movie. I know that. I don't know if I'm going crazy. I don't know if I'm really seeing anything. I don't know why my daughter said what she said during the sleepover. It's real to me, and other little things have started to happen that even other members of my family have noticed that lead me to believe I'm not going crazy. Something is really happening.